Hey, good day, everybody. I'm Marty Walser, also known as the Raging Owlbear on social media. This week, I'm going to talk about another alternative to Dungeons and Dragons. This is sort of third installment of this sort of impromptu series, I guess you would say. In the first video I did, I basically went through a whole list of various fantasy and sci-fi alternatives to Dungeons and Dragons. The last video, I talked specifically about one offering from Cubicle 7 called the Lone Wolf Adventure Game. And this week, I'm also going to talk about another Cubicle 7 game that's called The One Ring and its companion game, Adventures in Middle Earth. I do not have the One Ring hardback. Currently, I bought it in PDF, so that's why I use the transition instead. But be that as may, I wanted to talk a little bit about these. Obviously, Dungeons and Dragons is the huge RPG that most people are aware of. But this particular offering from Cubicle 7, The One Ring, and Adventures in Middle Earth, are very, very notable. And I want to talk a little bit about what the difference between the two is. So The One Ring is a role-playing game based in the Lord of the Rings universe, in Tolkien's universe, and it happens. The setting is after the Hobbit, but before all of the events in the Lord of the Rings. So the Battle of the Five Armies has occurred at the end of the Hobbit, and the dwarves have retaken the mountain from Smog. The humans have rebuilt Dale, outside of Erebor, the lonely mountain. And basically, civilization is starting to sort of, rebuild from the ashes of the dragon and various things. But that said, the shadow, the enemy, is, still there's forces at work in the world that are trying to impinge on civilization. And so the One Ring and Adventures in Middle Earth are set in that time period, after the Hobbit and before the War of the Ring. And you're basically adventuring in the land of Middle Earth and in that setting. Um, the difference between the One Ring RPG and the Adventures in Middle Earth game is the One Ring is its own system. It uses D6s and a D12. Um, but the Adventures in Middle Earth is kind of a a translation of the One Ring system into the Dungeons and Dragons sort of fifth edition style mechanics. So using the open gaming license and the various things that Wizards of the Coast allows you to do with the D&D rules, they created the 5e version of the One Ring, and they called it Adventures in Middle Earth. Both of these RPGs, again, set in the Lord of the Rings universe, and they are very much a sort of low magic, kind of lower fantasy than sort of that standard D&D fantasy. So there's kind of low power, low magic. Magic is actually doesn't you don't really have spellcasting classes. There aren't wizards. You can't go around as Gandalf. You're basically adventurers. You're hobbits. You're lake town men, or you're the woodsmen who live on the edges of Mirkwood, or the elves that live within Mirkwood, the dwarves that come from Erebor, that have reclaimed the Smaugs, the Lonely Mountain. And basically you come together and form a party and do some of those sort of fantasy tropes where a group of people comes together and goes on quests and stuff like that. But again, with the sort of lower magic, lower power setting, the feel of the One Ring and the feel of Adventures of Middle Earth is very different from what you have in fifth edition. And that said, the sort of classes in Adventure of Middle Earth, there are some D&D like classes, but they again try to sort of lower that sort of heroic over the top thing that you get when you play in Dungeons and Dragons, especially 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Um, but you do have, again, you have sort of the race and class paradigm in Adventures in Middle Earth. You pick your culture, which can be several human cultures, the men of Bree, those who follow King Bard, who has rebuilt the city of Dale after Lake Town was burned. There are still people living in Lake Town, so you have the Lake Town men. You have people who follow Bjorn, called the Bjornings, the Rohirrim, etc., 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 Minas Tirith, etc. And then you also have elves and hobbits and dwarves. And in the base set, there's just the Mirkwood elves, the dwarves from Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and the hobbits from the Shire. But in some of the other supplemental books, there are variations to that. You have the Rivendell elves, and you have et cetera, et cetera. So it's not the races or the cultures, what they call them in Adventures in Middle Earth. The cultures are not sort of as monoculture as you would think elves and dwarves and such. So there's a little bit of that, but again, you have different human types. You have, if you get some of the supplements, you have the different elves, you have different dwarves, and then you have classes that are much more low fantasy. You have the scholar, you have the treasure hunter, which is kind of the rogue. You have a slayer, which is a barbarian, like basically a warrior race. Like the Rohirrim might be a slayer type because they're horse fighters. And then you have wardens and wanderers who might be like the Dunedain, like Strider, the Rangers, etc. And the Rangers aren't their own class. The Rangers are the Dunedain are actually a culture that you can, so that Strider idea. You can create a Dunedain who is a slayer, or a Dunedain who is even a scholar, or such and such. You can sort of tweak around with the idea. But again, you have the wardens, which are kind of like rangers. So you could be an elfin warden or a human warden or whatnot, and basically you're fighting against the enemy. You're fighting against Shadow. And then you have like standard warriors who are more like your man at arms, your soldiers, your professional, your professional soldiers. But basically all of the classes, again, there isn't a lot of magic. They do have some features that are somewhat like D&D. There is some healing, where your party can rest, and you can give back hit points for certain classes and cultures and whatnot. But it tries to keep it much more subtle. It tries to make it more feel like the sort of narrative fantasy that you find in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. One of the really central pieces of both the One Ring and Adventures in Middle Earth is the concept of journeys. And basically, an adventure isn't necessarily just something that is at a particular location and you go there and you delve the dungeon or you do the thing. The journey mechanic kind of broadens that idea. It almost makes it like an old school hex crawl, because the whole thing about planning your quest is you're not just, again, going to this one location where you sort of hand wave the traveling to that location. As a matter of fact, the journey to go someplace and to do a thing is very much a part of the heart of these role-playing games, is that you get your resources, you have a map, you might have a player map, and then you plan what your route is going to be. So especially in the sort of Lord of the Rings universe, you have the map of Middle Earth, and this is the classic one that looks like the old school Hobbit adventures, and basically you say, okay, we're over here right now, and we need to cross the mountains, or we need to travel along this road that's near Mirkwood. But basically, as the players, you plan that route, and then the game master then, based upon your route, decides, figures out how dangerous it's going to be, how long the journey is going to be, and you have to move from like what are called sanctuaries, which are basically a town or an elven stronghold, or these very safe locations, and so the whole idea of Adventures in Middle Earth and the One Ring is you're traveling between these pockets of civilization that are kind of safe, but then all the wild lands in between are very, very dangerous. With the exception of a few places where civilization has kind of cleared the way and allowed for trading and whatnot. But you plan your journey on the maps, and again, the game master has their own version of the map that shows how dangerous certain areas are. And then you have, okay, well, this journey is going to take 50 days, and you have these mechanics to show the passage of time, and you may have these not really random encounters, but these little mini adventures, these little side things that occur to you along this journey, and that's very much the heart of Adventures of Middle Earth and the One Ring. It's not just that destination spot where some piece of action is happening and you kind of skip completely past all the travel, like, oh, we get on our horses, we ride to the next town, we go do the thing. No, the part of the adventure is that journey, and that feeling that you want to get from the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, of that they're traveling for many days and they encounter hardships, and then they have victories, and then may have defeats, and that's very much at the heart of these role-playing games, and it's one of the things I absolutely love. It's this journeys mechanic is absolutely fantastic, and the great thing about it is, especially with Adventures of Middle Earth, you can adapt, because it's 5th edition rules, you can adapt a lot of these mechanical ideas into your regular D&D game. Now, the journeys mechanic doesn't always quite work in standard D&D because there are certain classes, magic using classes, wizards, the rangers of D&D rangers, not the Lord of the Rings rangers, but D&D rangers, have some class features that basically say travel is a non-issue. We ignore difficult terrain, we have no problem hunting, we, at the blah, 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 blah. And so the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition takes a lot of that sort of danger and uncertainty of going from place to place. It handwaves all that. It basically, 5th edition made the designers of 5th edition sort of made the design decision that says, we're not going to focus so much on the traveling stuff. And so there aren't a lot of rules about like, going through the wilderness, and there's some in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but it doesn't get a lot of hard play, and especially like you said, you have druids and rangers and stuff like that in regular D&D that basically there's no problem getting food, there's no problem getting water, there's no difficulty traveling over even dangerous roads. They kind of hand wave a lot of that, and they kind of pulled that out of the older school games. They said, that's not what people want to focus on. They like the battles, they like that, and then which is absolutely fine. But it's one of the things that I really love about Adventures in Middle Earth and the One Ring is this focus on the journey is long and hard, and it's very much a part of the adventure. It's not just some downtime in between. Oh, we spend 5 days on the road and then we arrive at the next city. No, it's like you very much that journey is part of the adventure, is very important to the adventure, and it also determines at the end of our journey, are we tired? Are we exhausted? Do we have despair? Is our hope lost? And especially in the Lord of the Rings universe, that's very important. You have essentially the shadow who's working against you. You have your sort of hope, and then you have this sort of despair, these shadow points, which is a mechanic that basically, especially when you're out on the road for a long time, you get worn down and you get tired, and bad things are happening to you and whatnot, and so you kind of get overwhelmed with some of this despair. And so then when you get to your final destination, you're weary, and so that makes whatever events that are occurring at that destination, maybe more challenging because your party has gone through this very arduous journey. Um, and so that's one like really nice, mechanic that is really wonderful in the One Ring and in Adventures of the Middle Earth. And um, there's another one uh, that talks about in the Lore Masters book, which is this one. This is the player's. Sorry, this is the player's guide. This is the Lore Masters book. Back up here for a minute. In the Lore Masters book, they'd also talk about like what's the role of important NPCs, and actually when you go to visit a king or you're visiting the elves and you meet with one of the high elves, one of the king or the queen, or they have the idea of it's an audience, and so you have this social aspect to the role playing when you're having an audience with a very important person who could be a patron or a potential patron. But so they give a little bit more rules and mechanics around dealing with important NPCs, which is really nice, and it's something that can very much be adapted in a regular D&D game. So like, even if you don't want to adventure in the Lord of the Rings, these books are actually really great for any kind of low fantasy D&D game you want to play. There's obviously the Lord of the Rings lore is wrapped very much in what's in the book, but there's so many mechanics that are adaptable to a standard D&D game, and especially the classes too. You can very much use the classes if you wanted to try to do a low power, low magic D&D. So yeah, there's journeys, there's audiences. One of the other great things that I love about the Lore Masters book too is there are rules in Dungeons and Dragons that are about terrain, like when to use advantage and disadvantage, but they're not very detailed. They leave a lot up to the interpretation of the dungeon master. And again, because journeying is so important and key to the idea behind Adventures in Middle Earth and the One Ring, they actually have some really great examples of, hey, when you're on the battlefield, here's how this different type of terrain, affects your capabilities. And whether you're in the woods or whether you're in the marshland or stuff like that. And it talks about, it's harder to, because of the trees, it's harder to do archery. So, the ranged attacks get disadvantage and stuff like that. And so it's all things that if you were to go through the core Dungeons and Dragons D&D rules, you could make up. You could be like, oh yeah, okay, let me think about it. What's in a marshland, and how would that affect combat? How would that affect movement? But it's not just, oh, you have difficult terrain and you have disadvantage. It goes into a little bit more detail. And it talks about all kinds of stuff, like, are you in heavy forest? Are you in light forest? Are you in the marsh? Is it muddy? Is it, and so the Lore Master's Guide has just like a whole section on environmental factors related to combat and related to traveling and whatnot. And I love that. I mean, it's something that, like, oh my god, I can pull this stuff directly into my regular D&D game. This is something that's not just about Adventures in Middle Earth. These are great mechanics for a regular D&D game. Just as a reminder, because you're not always, as the dungeon master, you're not always remembering all the environmental factors. You think about it and like, oh, there's advantage, disadvantage, and oh, that person's on high ground, or that person, but this gives you like all the details and sticks it in your mind so that during the game you're remembering to sort of add those flourishes of this area is challenging. This particular, you're fighting in the bog, and you're trying to pull your boots out, and it's muddy and it's hard and whatnot. And so what can cause exhaustion, or if you have to run through a thicket, you get some damage from the thorns, and how difficult is it to move, and how, basically all those environmental factors goes into great detail, so that when you build a battle or you build a scene, you have all that at your fingertips. You can add those really nice flourishes, and it adds just that much more flavor of, you're deep in the woods, you're in Mirkwood, or you're in another area of woodlands, and these are the troubles you're going to run into on the road. Very much love that part. So, without like making this video too long, I definitely say if you're into the Lord of the Rings, or even if you just are really interested in doing a D&D setting that's low fantasy, and you want to stick to 5th edition rules, but you want something, so you want it to be familiar for your players, you don't want to necessarily try a new game system, absolutely pick these up. Now, there's one thing. Cubicle 7, they lost the Lord of the Rings license. It was a licensing dispute with the current license holder. So Adventures in Middle-earth and the One Ring RPG are pretty much out of print. Adventures in Middle-earth, you can still find a lot of stuff. The books are out there. They're very much still in distribution. You can get them off of Amazon. You can buy the PDFs on DriveThruRPG. Please use my links that I'm gonna put at the bottom of the video, because that just helps me get more game books and talk about stuff online. So very much if you're looking for that 5th edition idea, these are just wonderful, wonderful books. Absolutely should have in your collection for sort of a low fantasy game. If you want something a little different than Adventures in Middle-earth or the D&D 5th edition, but you still love the Tolkien theme, absolutely think about the One Ring RPG. The one thing that I think the One Ring does maybe a little better than Adventures in Middle-earth is I think the One Ring holds that Tolkien-esque environmental feel a little bit better than Adventures in Middle-earth, and only because because of sort of staying compatible with D&D 5th edition, there is a little bit of a power creep in the classes. As you gain levels and you go up, you're getting a lot of hit points. So at the early levels, it feels very much low power, low fantasy, but as you gain levels, just like in 5th edition, Adventures in Middle-earth does have a little bit of a power curve. Not as bad as, say, D&D 5th edition, or I want to say bad, but not as super heroic as D&D 5th edition, but it's there. And they tried to make it a little more subtle to make it still feel like Lord of the Rings, and make it feel like you're not this just, you're not Iron Man, repulsor ray, boom, boom, knocking down orcs left and right. But it does have, again, that power creep that exists in Dungeons and Dragons, especially at higher levels. The one thing that the One Ring does better is it has a much lower power curve. And so I think the One Ring feels more dangerous even as you've journeyed for a while. I mean, your characters definitely do excel, and they get better, and they get harder to kill. But it's still a little bit more of a gradual upswing. And so I actually prefer the One Ring for that, but both systems are wonderful. If obviously Adventures in Middle-earth is going to be great for you if you're familiar with D&D and you don't want to really learn a new system, because all the sort of roots of sort of that D&D, the 5th edition mechanics are there. But I definitely think, if you like Lord of the Rings, check out the One Ring. The one thing I do have to say about the One Ring, because it is out of print, Adventures in Middle-earth still available a lot. The One Ring books are becoming a little more scarce. They're harder to find, especially the core rulebook. And I'm actually bummed that I didn't get a hardback of the core rulebook, because they've become very expensive on the secondary market. You have to keep an eye out for them. I don't think that'll go on forever, because they've just recently gone out of print, so prices have kind of shot up as people are like, ooh, speculating, A lot of the supplements are still at their normal retail price, to $20 to $30 range or whatnot. So the supplements are still out there. Obviously, older supplements that have been longer out of print are, their prices are going up. But DriveThruRPG has all the PDFs, so you can purchase the PDF of the One Ring still. I don't know how long that will continue. now that the license is gone. I don't know if their PDF sales are at some point we're going to end, and probably sooner rather than later. So I would absolutely get there. I'll put the links to drive through on the video. I'll put the links to Amazon. Go out and buy this. I mean, just if you're looking for something interesting in an RPG, I mean, it is Lord of the Rings bog standard fantasy, but it's a great book. Oh, and I haven't even talked about the art. The art is wonderful. If you are aware of the art from the Lord of the Rings in the 70s and the 80s, one of the artists back then, John Howe, some of his art, it has that same feel of that sort of those early Lord of the Rings, illustrations. Let's see if I can get you this. So these beautiful, single page or 2-page illustrations. This is about the Shire, and this looks like a picture of something like the Elven, I guess this is a Shire picture too, or perhaps an Elven abode somewhere in the edge of Mirkwood. So there's a lot of these. There's black and white ones. There's these beautiful color images, and they're just. Oops, let me get it lined up with the camera. So you can see, and actually, if you watched my video about Lone Wolf RPG last week, you'll recognize that a lot of the art is very similar. If I pull it back, I get a little bit of a glare. So a lot of the same artists that worked for Cubicle 7 on Lone Wolf also worked on Adventures in Middle-earth, but they actually do have some pieces from John Howe, who's a very well-known artist, Lord of the Rings artist from way back when. He also worked on the movies with God, I just forgot the director's name. Peter, what's his face? sorry. My mind just totally blanked out. But so the art is very much like that old school Lord of the Rings art, especially if you're like me and you're older and you had those Lord of the Rings wall calendars from the 80s and early 90s and whatnot. Maybe they continued to print them all throughout the 2000s. I don't know. I don't have any Lord of the Rings calendars from that era, but the John Howe, I think it is. There was two really guys. There's two artists that were really well known, but the art style for Adventures of Middle-earth and and the One Ring very much draw from all that historic art from Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's just it just oozes the theme of Lord of the Rings. So, video's gotten a little long. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I put these videos kind of out intermittently. Sometimes I do a bunch in a row and then nothing for a while. So please like and subscribe. Put the little ding so you know when my stuff comes out. I'd love to get a little higher in the YouTube ranks. But, definitely check out Cubicle 7's Adventures in Middle-earth, the One Ring RPG. They're absolutely worth it. I'm not getting paid by Cubicle 7. I know this is the second Cubicle 7 role-playing game I've featured, but it's just they both recently have been kind of out of print, and I wanted people to get to know them and grab those books before they're no longer on Amazon or they're no longer available, because they're still out there. Even though both Lone Wolf and Adventures in Middle-earth and the One Ring RPG, all of them are sort of out of print now, they're still out there. Get them while you can, and you can still pick up the PDFs always. So do it right now. Links below. Click buy. You trust me, it'll be worth it. It'll be great for your role playing, no matter what system you're playing. There's just so many lovely, beautiful ideas in these books, and they're just a pleasure to read. So I've been Marty Walser, also known as Raging Owlbear, on social media. Check out my Twitter feed. This is my YouTube channel. Hope to see you again real soon.